Hi there, everybody. Welcome back to What I Did With Music Today During Quarantine with your host, Mr. Liss, aka KJ Liss, aka Kyle Liss. It is Monday, April 6th. I hope you all had a fantastic weekend. The title of today's episode is Crafting a Modern Solo. So I started this show last week just because I really needed to feel like I was still teaching my students, to be honest. It's been hard to be away from them during quarantine. I usually get to see hundreds of students every single day and feel like I'm guiding their musical journey. And now, other than my hour of office hours, I don't get any direct contact. So this is like my educator coming out through YouTube, and hopefully you found it useful. But what I've been trying to do is balance creating this show with creating my own music. So I decided that on the weekend I'm going to focus on creating, and Monday through Friday make this show. So I hope you enjoy it. Today's episode comes from something I did over the weekend. On Friday, I started a new track. I started composing a brand new tune, and then to borrow the name of a famous jazz standard, in the wee small hours of the morning, this solo came out, and I worked on it quite a lot, and I wanted to give some insight into what that experience is like and what that process is like to craft what I would call a modern solo, a pseudo improvised solo that fits within modern music. So we're going to listen and watch the solo first, and then we're going to come back and talk about it. So I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek of this brand new track. It's rough, it's unmixed, it's unmastered, it's a work in progress, but sometimes that's a lot of fun to see. And in particular, I hope you enjoyed getting to see a little bit of my keyboard soloing. And what I realized as I was doing this solo is that a lot of people might not realize what that process looks like, at least for me, and I think for a lot of maybe more musicians than people realize in modern genres. So a lot of that solo is improvised, but parts of it are not exactly improvised. They're somewhat composed. And so the lineage of soloing in that way, right, taking a keyboard solo like that, comes through jazz, of course. So if you don't know, I'm a jazz musician kind of by trade. That was my undergraduate degree, was in jazz performance before I'm getting my master's in music education. And I've studied classical music and all sorts of other genres. But for me, when I thought about improvised music and improvised solos as a younger musician, I always assumed it was just made off the top of the head. And then I had this teacher in college. His name was Tom Garling. He was arranger for Maynard Ferguson's big band, incredible trombonist, who taught our jazz composition and arranging class, and yet insisted that improvisation wasn't really a real thing. He insisted that everything you play had been kind of played at some point before, so that in some way improvisation wasn't real. Now, I found that kind of like shocking, as a young jazz musician in college, but over time I've started to, I think, at least in my own way, understand what he means. So what we're going to do is we're going to delve into Ableton, which is, I've mentioned, I think before in previous episodes, the piece of software that I compose and create initially in. And we're going to see, I'm going to kind of walk you through that evolution of this solo, how I at first completely improvised it. And then as I progressed, I refined. So I took things that I liked in each progressive take, and then I kept them and then refined them so that the end product, my final take that I'm pretty happy with, is not truly improvised. There's moments that I played exactly the same way time and time again, but then there's moments where there's spaces for more improvisation. And the end result is something I think that really fits with the modern ear, the modern listener, which is produced. It sounds very, polished. So even though there is that lineage of improvisation that goes all the way back through jazz and blues, there's still something more modern and polished about it. So let's dive into Ableton and you can see what I'm talking about. At the very top here, this is the piano right here. And then this is my Prophet 08 synthesizer doubling the piano. So I have it set up so that I can play the keyboard on my Nord, my piano, and then that can simultaneously record and control my Prophet 08 synthesizer over here. So they're playing the exact same thing just with different tones, and that's a cool opportunity to explore some different layering. So I'll show you what that looks like soloed in the final take of the solo that I came up with. And I'll take out the piano. So that synth is under there the whole time. And here's the piano without it. So it's just adding a little bit of grit and warmth and character to the piano that's giving it something extra, which, is actually not that easy to perceive, but without it, hopefully you heard how different the piano sounds without that. So anyway, that's my layer that I have going on here. And up here, this is the very first take of the solo before I decided to layer on the Prophet. So we're not going to look at that, but we're just going to listen to the beginning of what I would call the second take of the solo here. So if you think back to the solo we listened to earlier, you might actually notice quite a number of similarities between what I just played and that other solo. So that's what I kind of really want to outline for you here, is what this process looks like. Because often we find, I think, as improvisers, there's often first idea, best idea. That's a great phrase as creative people that I think we can lean into, not to question our creative process, just first idea, best idea. Put it on paper, put it in there. So there were a lot of ideas I really liked there, and I was tempted after I listened to the first take to be like, oh man. But then this part of me really wanted to get this more produced approach. So I've been listening, as I mentioned on the episode the other day, to this producer Kiefer, who's this incredible producer. He's a pianist, keyboardist, definitely incredible jazz musician for sure. Also produces tracks like hip hop for like Anderson .Paak and other artists that are really, really phenomenal. So he's got all the skills. He's got the playing skills, but also the producing skills that I really admire. And so when I listen to his stuff, it sounds so polished. And I think the modern listener is expecting more polish than old jazz had. So with classic jazz, when you listen to jazz from like the 60s and 70s, sometimes these days especially, you'll see alternate takes. So alternate takes are, I think, started to really get released around CDs and when there was more space than on a vinyl. And it's just a literal alternate version of the song from the studio. But when you listen to those, they sound like real different. The solos are very, very different between the take that was released and the alternate take. So what I get there is that was a time when, improvised solos were really truly improvised like all the time. But I think more modern musicians than people expect use this other technique that's somewhere between improvisation and composition. It's kind of like a hybrid of both. So when I listened back to that early solo, there were a lot of things I really liked about it, especially that opening riff. You might notice if you remember back to the other solo, there's a lot of things that, I kept that opening riff. So now let's go further on down here. Here's, some silly naming conventions and then some unnamed ones that just like I kept because I didn't want to delete them, but weren't that great. So here's the one called Best So Far. Let's listen to that. So that really fast lick that we just passed is one of those things that was a hybrid of improvisation and composition. So when I listened back to my very first takes, I thought, man, there's this like bebop flavor. And I'm going to say I'm not like really a bebop jazz musician. That's never been my main thing. Of course, that language, like any jazz musician, has worked its way into my playing, the chromaticism and the way kind of lines flow together, the arpeggios. But that's never been my main thing. However, I immediately heard a little bit of bop language when I listened back to my first takes, and I decided I'm just going to lean into that. I'm going to go for that aesthetic because it just really felt like it fit over these chord changes that I had written. So that last little riff, I'm just going to play that for you again. So that last little riff there came from a lot of me just sitting there at the keyboard and being like, oh wait, no, I don't want that. I wasn't playing it that fast, by the way. I was playing it slowly and then thinking about the chord changes just in my head and then being like, oh wait, yeah, that's it. And I came up with that riff. And for every solo from like, up here onwards through the entirety, I decided I'm going to play that riff, that lick at that exact time, every time. That's going to be like a kind of focal point of my solo is that riff. And so it's not exactly improvised, but it's not exactly just truly composed either because it came from the idea of an improvisation. So this kind of ties in like improvisation and composition to me are very related processes always. And I believe that's true for master composers in the classical tradition as well. There's these awesome stories about Debussy, who is my like hero composer, about how at dinner parties he used to just improvise for like hours at a time for his guests when they would come over to his home. And he would just be sitting at the piano making things up and people are like, that's music like I've never heard before. So I think for all composers, there's this great similarity between improvisation and composition. And that's kind of what you're seeing here. So then there's this solo down further, crazy shred, and then the jam, and then real solid. So you see, I'm just like naming things, trying to figure out, well, what do I want? Am I done? When you're at home, there's no limit to what you can do. That can be really liberating because you don't have to pay for a studio. The only limitation is your time. Do I want to keep going right now? It can also be double-edged because you can just sit there and kind of beat yourself over the head. Oh man, wait, was that it? Was the last take it? And then you have to sort through all this stuff over here and then be like, wait, which one is the one? So this kind of approach for me, it forces me into commitment. I have to keep going until I get it. And then I don't actually even listen to the other ones. I prefer to keep a solo intact instead of splicing them up and combining them like some people might do. I prefer to keep it intact and just get it. And when I decide I get it, I've gotten it and it's done. And I don't even actually go back and torture myself by listening to the other ones. I just decide that was it. So that for me is kind of what this process of crafting a modern solo is as well. So let's listen to just a little bit of the end of Crazy Shred. So yeah, that one is a little crazy. To me, it sounds a little out of control crazy. It doesn't really sound polished. It doesn't really sound clean. And so that's why ultimately, I labeled it Crazy Shred because I thought, oh, there's some cool stuff. But, it's not something I'm going to go with ultimately. So then I just kept going and going and going, another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you'll see I labeled the 1, 2, the actual one. So I thought I got it 3 times in a row, but something in me just said, keep going. And this is what it's always been like for me when I've been crafting these solos. I've decided, on a few key points, and then I've kept going until I just felt something in me say, that was it. That was the take. That was it right there. Hopefully you enjoyed this glimpse into my process of crafting a modern solo. To bring it all together, I'd really say that there's 4 main parts of this process for me when I go about creating one of these solos like we've been talking about today. So the very first part of that process is going to be true improvisation. For me, with my jazz roots, nothing else feels truly authentic. If I just go right to composing a solo, it doesn't really feel like there's any like spark of spontaneity. And I can't stand that as an artist personally. That's just a personal feeling. The second part of that process is going to be listening back to what I've done and trying to identify, are there any really good, juicy like riffs or licks in there that I know I want to keep? Is there anything I want to commit to? And then the next part of that, once I've identified those, is refinement. So I'm going to take those things I heard that I really liked, and then I'm going to rehearse them, compose them, refine them, like I've already mentioned, bring them all together, and then identify some focal points of my solo. And then I'm going to, in between those, I am going to keep truly improvising. And then the fourth step is just continuing to do that, going with the focal points, keeping those consistent, having the true improvisation in between until there's this feeling that I got it, I did it, okay, and then it's done. And then for me, not going back, not listening again, just going with it. So that's a glimpse into this process. I hope you enjoy. Please come back tomorrow and check out the next episode. Thank you so much and have a great day.